My name is Dorian Ellison. But that night, I wasn't just Dorian, I was her weird cousin. Isla's words, not mine. She'd said it with a lilt, like it was a harmless little joke. But the way her friends, no, colleagues, laughed, that told me everything I needed to know about the room I'd walked into. I'd paid for half the catering, the flower arrangements, the fancy signature drinks Isla insisted on to make the evening memorable. Memorable for her, maybe. For me? I was the tag-along. The prop. The one she placed in the corner with a grin and a dismissive wave. Oh, that's just my cousin. He's a bit eccentric, from out west. I didn't correct her. I didn't crack a smile or fake a laugh. I stood there, a glass of something fizzy in hand, and watched the way Isla moved through the room like a stage performer. She was good at this, charming, magnetic, eyes bright with manufactured interest as she asked about projects and quarterly targets and the latest designer bag that really spoke to her. She cultivated that crowd carefully handpicked, like she did everything else. Until someone, some eager young exec with an expensive watch and a too-wide smile, asked, "So, what's your name again? And what do you do?" I could feel Isla's eyes on me even before I turned my head. Her gaze was sharp, expectant, almost pleading. "Don't say too much," that look said. "Don't embarrass me." I cleared my throat and let my voice carry, just enough to reach the small circle around me. "Ellison," I said. "Dorian Ellison." The name landed like a spark on dry grass. A pause. A ripple. I saw Bertrand Wexley, Isla's boss, the man she'd practically knighted in every dinner conversation, freeze mid-drink. His eyes widened. He tried to hide it, but I'd seen enough boardrooms to read panic. "Ellison," he repeated, his voice low, like he was testing a memory. "As in Ellison Dynamics?" The silence that followed was sharp, like a knife's edge. The kind of silence that cracks masks. I didn't smile. Didn't wink or nod like this was all a show. I just met his gaze evenly and said, "Yes." And in that moment, I wasn't Isla's weird cousin anymore. I wasn't the man in the corner. I was the name every single person in that room recognized, even if they hadn't known it was me. Wexley's hand trembled around his glass. I saw Julianne Vale, the marketing director with the perfectly curated LinkedIn profile, glance at her phone, no doubt pulling up the latest acquisition rumors. Greg Morrell, the VP of operations who once called me Isla's silent partner in sweatpants, blinked like he'd misread the world. And Isla? Her smile wavered. Her voice, so confident a second ago, faltered like a candle in a breeze. She stepped closer, as if to reclaim the narrative. "Oh, Dorian, I didn't realize you'd met Bertrand." Her tone dripped with a too-bright cheer. I could practically hear the gears turning in her head, the quick scramble for damage control. I turned to her, slow and measured. "No," I said. "We haven't formally met." I let the pause hang there, long enough for her to hear the quiet I'd carried in every room she'd tried to shape. Wexley cleared his throat, voice trembling. "Ellison Dynamics is the parent company of..." He stopped himself, like he'd realized too late that he'd spoken aloud. I didn't fill the silence for him. Let the room do that. Let the weight of my name, and what it meant, settle into every corner of the space she'd once dominated so effortlessly. Isla's lips pressed together. I could see the panic behind her eyes, the same panic I'd seen in boardrooms across the country when the quiet man in the corner turned out to be the one with the final signature. I didn't need to raise my voice, didn't need to flash credentials or drop revenue figures. I'd spent my whole life building Ellison Dynamics on the foundation of being underestimated, on being the man no one saw coming until it was too late. And that night, at Isla's carefully curated party, I was done playing the role she'd written for me. I felt the shift in the air, a subtle shiver as laughter turned into questions, as questions turned into silence, as silence turned into something else entirely. A few people drifted closer, eyes wide, drinks forgotten. I met Isla's gaze calm, steady. For the first time that evening, she looked small. She tried to recover, voice high and tight. "Well, Dorian's always been a bit of a mystery." I didn't let her finish. "Not a mystery," I said. "Just a man who knows when to speak." And with that, I took a sip from my glass. No toast, no fireworks, no dramatic walkout. Just a sip, steady and silent, as the room tried to figure out what story they'd just walked into. Isla's laughter never returned to that room. Not the way it had before. And me? I let the silence speak for me. For once, I didn't mind being the center of attention. Isla always liked to downplay me. especially in rooms she wanted to dominate. She'd mastered the art of the well-timed laugh, the head tilt, the eyes that sparkled at just the right moment. I'd seen it all from the sidelines, learning the rhythm of her social theater. The way she held her wine glass like a scepter, each gesture deliberate, every word carefully curated for the right effect. She was a born performer, a woman who could own a room with a single raised eyebrow. I admired it once. There was a time when I'd been content to be the man behind the scenes, the quiet partner, the one who made sure the bills were paid and the foundation was steady while she soared on her carefully constructed wings. I'd wanted her to shine. I'd wanted to see her dazzle the world with that unstoppable drive of hers. But somewhere along the way, she stopped letting me stand beside her, and instead, started using me as part of the set. I saw it that night, more clearly than I'd ever let myself admit. She laughed too loudly at someone's joke about her eccentric cousin, then shot me that smile that said play along. A mask. A performance. I took another sip of my drink and let the fizz settle on my tongue, keeping my own smile polite, unassuming, decorative. She wanted me there as a prop, safe, unimpressive, unlikely to outshine her in a room where she wanted every light on her. I was the wrong kind of impressive for Isla. Too quiet, too cautious, too successful in ways she didn't know how to showcase. My wins weren't the kind you could pin on a vision board or brag about over brunch. They came in contracts signed behind closed doors and technology that changed lives in ways she'd never cared to understand. She liked success when it came with a spotlight, one she could step into, hair perfect, lips curled, ready for applause. But me? I was her placeholder. The man who drove her to the airport, carried her suitcase, fixed the leaky faucet in the bathroom she never mentioned to her friends. I was the man she didn't bring into the light because he didn't fit the narrative she'd curated for herself. And I let her. For too long, I let her. I stood at the edge of the room, the conversation swirling around me like a dance I hadn't learned. People drifted past, faces eager and bright, voices climbing and falling in rehearsed crescendos. I recognized the look in their eyes, the same one I'd seen at board meetings when a deal was about to close. Hungry, calculating, polite enough to mask the ambition. I caught Isla's gaze from across the room as she charmed a cluster of men in tailored suits. She leaned in, her hand on the sleeve of one man's jacket, a laugh that floated high and sweet. Her eyes found mine for half a second, just long enough for me to see the spark of discomfort, the flicker of uncertainty. Maybe she'd sensed the shift in the air after Wexley's question, the way the room had changed once my last name hit the floor like a dropped match. She turned back to her audience, smoothing that expression into something warm and inviting, but I saw the tremor in her hands as she gestured. Decorative silence. That's what she'd assigned me tonight. I was the quiet man in the corner, the one she could pat on the shoulder like a family pet when the laughter grew too loud. I'd felt it before, at dinners, at conferences, at family holidays where my role was to fill in the edges, to patch the gaps between her lines so her story could shine. I let her. I let her because I thought it was love, because I thought supporting her meant staying small. But in that moment, as the party carried on around me and the shadows of my name stretched through every conversation, I realized how much I'd given up to stay silent. Wexley's laughter had become nervous now, his voice tight as he tried to steer the conversation back to something safe. But there was no putting that genie back in the bottle. The name was out there, the power had shifted, and even the polished executives in the room couldn't ignore the tremor in his tone. Greg Morrell tried to salvage the mood by telling some half-hearted joke about being among tech royalty. It fell flat. No one laughed. I watched Isla's lips press into a thin line, her eyes darting to me, then away, as if she was afraid to meet the gaze of the man she'd called her cousin. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even smug. I was just done. Done playing the part she'd written. Done being the decorative silence that let her monologue go unchallenged. Done being the man she pulled out of the corner when it suited her and tucked away when it didn't. She drifted over eventually, her expression forced and bright. "Dorian, could you grab me a drink?" She asked, her tone sweet, her voice pitched like we were still playing the same old game. I met her gaze, steady and unblinking. "You can get it yourself." Her smile wavered. Her eyes darted around, searching for someone else to play the part of her eager assistant. No one moved. Even the chatter seemed to hush, as if the room was waiting for me to say something else. But I didn't. I let the silence grow, heavy and thick, until it settled between us like a wall. She gave me that look then, the one she'd used to shut down arguments, to remind me of my place in her story. But it didn't work anymore. I wasn't the weird cousin tonight. I wasn't the man she'd made small so she could feel big. I was Dorian Ellison, the man who'd spent years building something she'd never bothered to ask about. The man who'd watched her curate a world that couldn't hold the truth of who I was. And in that room, surrounded by her curated perfection, I realized I'd spent too long letting her shape me into something. The party was in full swing, perfectly arranged by Isla, down to the flower arrangements that matched the linen napkins, the soft background music that shifted seamlessly from one corporate acceptable playlist to the next, and the curated guest list that made her the center of every conversation. I watched it all unfold like a well-rehearsed play, each actor hitting their mark, each line carefully rehearsed. It was Isla's night, and she built it with the same meticulous care she gave to her Instagram captions, sharp, polished, and full of filters. The faces around me blurred into the same practiced smiles, the same gleaming teeth and sharp suits. Bertrand Wexley, of course, was the star guest, the man she'd been chasing with dinner invites and strategic small talk for months. Isla's eyes glowed whenever she looked at him, her voice shifting into that high, bright register she reserved for people who could help her climb. And then there was Julianne Vale, the marketing director with the signature bob and the smirk she wore like a badge of honor. Greg Morrell, the VP of Operations, was never far behind, with his practiced chuckle and dismissive tone that made him sound like he'd invented the art of condescension. I'd watched him once talk over a junior manager with the confidence of a man who'd never been challenged. And none of them knew I was the founder and majority shareholder of Ellison Dynamics, the tech conglomerate currently in acquisition talks with Wexley's firm. None of them knew that the quiet man with the simple dress shirt and unassuming smile was the one holding the strings they were all dancing on. Isla didn't know either. Not because I'd hidden it, but because she'd never asked. Not once. It wasn't in her script. She liked to tell people I'd dabbled in startups, like I was some hobbyist with a garage and a dream that never quite made it. A creative who spent his days tinkering with ideas that would never see the light of day. It made her feel bigger, like she was the one with the ambition and the network, the one with the polished edges. I let her. For years, I let her. But standing there, watching Wexley's wine glass stop midair as the name Ellison Dynamics fell from his lips, I realized just how brittle her curated perfection really was. Like fine china with a hairline crack that no one notices until the whole thing shatters. I watched the realization dawn on his face, the widening eyes, the stiffening of his posture, the subtle tremble in his hand as he placed the glass back on the table. Julianne Vale's head snapped toward me, her eyes narrowing as she reached for her phone. I could practically hear the Google search, Ellison Dynamics founder. Greg Morrell's face shifted from practiced indifference to a shade that looked like he'd seen a ghost. And Isla? Isla's eyes darted to me like a startled deer, panic flashing across her perfectly painted face. Her lips parted, but no sound came out at first. Then she stammered something, some line she must have rehearsed for a moment like this, though she'd never thought she'd have to say it in real life. Dorian, you're the founder? Her voice cracked on the last word, the illusion breaking apart piece by piece. I met her gaze with a calm I'd earned in boardrooms far colder than this one. Yes, I said simply. I own the firm that's reviewing Wexley's Q4 acquisition pitch. The words settled like thunder. A hush spread through the room, the laughter dying as if someone had flipped a switch. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Glasses hovered, untouched. The hum of polite conversation gave way to a tension so thick I could taste it, metallic and sharp. Wexley's hand found the back of a chair, his knuckles white. Julianne's phone was frozen in her hand, the screen glowing with the search results she hadn't had the guts to read out loud. Greg Morrell's jaw worked like he was chewing on a confession he couldn't swallow. And Isla? She stood there, her carefully composed face crumbling in real time. Her eyes darted from me to Wexley, back to me, her lips parting like she might find the words that would glue her perfect narrative back together. But no words came. I let the silence stretch. I wanted her to feel it, the crack in the foundation she built so carefully. The truth that lay beneath the polished tiles and designer's shoes. I built Ellison Dynamics from a single idea, a sketch on the back of a coffee shop napkin in a rented studio apartment with a leaky faucet. I'd bootstrapped every dollar, signed every contract, weathered every storm until the company could stand on its own, until I could stand on my own. And she'd never asked me about it. Not once. She'd never asked what kept me up at night, what my dreams looked like, what I'd risked to build the empire she didn't even know she lived in. She'd never asked because it didn't fit the story she wanted to tell. And now, with one name, The story had cracked. I saw her eyes harden then, desperation clawing at the edges of her mask. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered, her voice so low only I could hear it. I let the silence answer her first. Then I leaned in, my voice calm, controlled. "Because you never asked." She blinked, once, twice. Her lips trembled. The room was still watching, the tension so thick I felt it pressing against my skin. She tried to smile, but it came out twisted, a forced curve that didn't reach her eyes. "We should talk about this, maybe later," she said, her voice bright but hollow. I nodded slowly. Maybe, but I knew the story had already shifted. Because the man she'd tried to keep in the shadows had stepped into the light, and the cracks in her curated perfection were too wide to fix. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like the background character in her narrative. I felt like the man who'd written the story all along. She'd just never bothered to read the script. I turned away from her then, letting the silence follow me like a crown. And I realized that sometimes the quietest voice in the room was the one that changed everything. Bertrand Wexley's face went pale the second he made the connection, Ellison, as in Ellison Dynamics. He didn't even try to hide the tremor in his voice as he repeated it, like he was testing the word on his tongue to see if it would taste different. The ice in his glass rattled in his hand, a tiny percussion that felt too loud in the sudden hush. A hush I hadn't created with a shout or a grand speech, but by simply existing in the room as myself. I felt every eye on me now. Julianne Vale's phone slipped into her purse, her smile tight, like she'd suddenly remembered she left the stove on. Greg Morrell, the man who once called me Isla's silent partner in sweatpants, stared at me as if he'd just realized the man in sweatpants owned the company he'd been pitching to. And Isla? Isla's eyes were wide, a glisten of panic behind them. Her lips parted, like she might try to laugh it off, but no sound came. The silence between us stretched, a gaping canyon that no carefully curated narrative could bridge. Wexley tried to find his footing. His voice was brittle, too thin for the room he'd once commanded. "You mean Ellison from Ellison Dynamics? The parent company of—" He stopped himself. He didn't need to finish. Everyone in the room had already filled in the blank. Everyone suddenly understood why the acquisition deal had stalled in the review phase, why their Q4 pitch hadn't yet moved to approval. I took a slow breath, my expression calm. I'd spent years learning to control every flicker of emotion in a boardroom. Tonight, I let that control wrap around me like armor. I met Wexley's gaze and nodded once, a quiet confirmation that shattered every assumption they'd built around me. "Yes," I said. My voice was steady, unremarkable, just the truth laid bare. "I own the firm that's reviewing your Q4 acquisition pitch." The words landed like a hammer. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Laughter evaporated. Even the music, an innocuous jazz playlist that had draped the room in polite sophistication, felt too loud now, its notes sharp and dissonant. Wexley's hand clutched the stem of his wine glass, his knuckles white, eyes darting between me and Isla like he was hoping for some explanation that would let him crawl out of this embarrassment. Julianne Vale shifted uncomfortably, crossing her arms and glancing at Isla, who looked like she'd been slapped. Greg Morrell's eyes were the most telling. He stared at me as though I'd grown an extra head, disbelief etched into every line of his face. I wondered how many times he dismissed me at dinners or company events, content to treat me as the man on the periphery of his world. Now he couldn't look away. Isla stepped forward, her voice trembling but trying to regain its polished edge. "Dorian, you never said." I cut her off with a look, just a look, and the words died in her throat. She built her world on carefully chosen details, on controlling the flow of information so she could always be the star in the narrative she wrote. But tonight, that narrative. I watched her struggle, and I wondered how many times she looked at me and decided I was safe to ignore. How many times she'd chosen to dim my light so hers would shine brighter. I didn't need to say any of that. I didn't need to raise my voice or gloat. The truth was louder than any accusation. Wexley cleared his throat, his voice hoarse. I wish you'd told us sooner." I tilted my head slightly, an eyebrow arched. "No one asked." The words hung there, simple and sharp, carving through the room like a scalpel. Greg Morrell's mouth opened, but no sound came. Julianne Vale's hands fidgeted with her phone. Even the waitstaff seemed to sense the shift, their polite smiles faltering as they moved more cautiously around the edges of the room. Isla's face flushed crimson. She'd spent years building a story where she was the star and I was the harmless background. Tonight, she realized the man in the shadows was the one with the final word on every deal they'd ever hoped to close. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I just let the silence stretch. Wexley tried to salvage his pride. Dorian, this changes things. His voice was high, the desperation playing. We'll need to discuss the acquisition terms. I let him flounder, his discomfort a mirror of every time I'd sat quietly at one of Isla's parties and listened to him brag about quarterly gains and strategic partnerships like I was too dumb to care. I sipped my drink, the cold fizz on my tongue a sharp contrast to the heat of the room. Of course, I said, my voice measured, even polite. We can discuss that in the proper forum. Not here. His face fell. He knew what that meant. No more backroom deals, no more whispered agreements over dinner. He'd have to face me across a conference table, with lawyers and spreadsheets and a boardroom that didn't bend to his charm. Isla's lips trembled, her eyes pleading. Dorian. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. I turned and set my empty glass on a tray, nodding politely to the staff as I made my way toward the door. The silence followed me, a chorus of shifting eyes and broken narratives. Behind me, Isla's voice rose in a panic. Dorian, please. I paused at the doorway, the hush of the room pressing against my back. I turned just enough to see her face, her perfectly curated, carefully made-up face, and I saw the cracks running through it. Next time, I said softly, maybe you should ask before you decide who someone is. Her lips parted, her eyes glistened, but I was already gone. I didn't need her apology. I didn't need her to fix what she'd broken. Because in that moment, leaving her in the room she'd built, I realized I'd never needed her permission to be the man I already was. I excused myself politely after 10 minutes. No fireworks, no dramatic exit, just a quiet nod to the server collecting empty glasses and a subtle slip through the sliding glass door that Isla insisted made the patio look bigger. I'd had enough of polite laughter that had turned brittle, of the eyes that followed me with a mix of fear and curiosity now that my name carried weight they hadn't been prepared for. Isla's voice reached me as I reached for my jacket, tight and frantic, laced with a desperate laugh. Dorian, wait. Let's talk about this. I turned slowly, the weight of the room pressing against my chest. Her smile was a shadow of the one she'd worn when she'd introduced me as her eccentric cousin. Now she couldn't quite find the right expression, somewhere between panic and forced charm. Talk about what? I asked, voice low and calm. I kept it steady because I knew anything louder would only feed the chaos. She stepped closer, heels clicking on the marble like a metronome counting down to something she couldn't quite control. Why didn't you tell me about Ellison Dynamics? About the acquisition talks? About any of this? I let the silence stretch, like I'd let it stretch in boardrooms when competitors made their first offer, and I knew they'd come back with a better one. Because you never asked. Her eyes darted around the room. Faces shifted, conversations paused, drinks were held at mid-lift, everyone waiting to see the outcome of this fight she'd started. I could see Wexley pretending to read a text, Julianne Vale pretending she wasn't eavesdropping, Greg Morrell pretending he'd never mocked me to my face. Dorian, this is not the time, she hissed, eyes darting toward her boss and her colleagues. It's exactly the time, I said, voice quiet but firm. You chose this time when you decided to call me your weird cousin. You chose this moment. She blinked, mascara clinging to tears she wouldn't let fall. Her lips trembled. It was a joke, Dorian. I was just trying to keep me small. I finished for her. She flinched like I'd struck her. I felt a pang of guilt, some old reflex from the days when I'd let her shape my narrative to make her comfortable. But the pang faded. Dorian, she tried again, voice wobbling. You know, I didn't mean it like that. I was just what, Isla? I asked, feeling the weight of every party, every dinner, every business meeting where she'd put me in the background so she could shine. Trying to keep your story intact? Make sure no one saw the cracks? Her lips parted but nothing came out. The room was silent, watching like an audience waiting for the final scene. I took a breath and looked at Wexley, whose face was still pale. Mr. Wexley, I said, my tone calm. You'll be hearing from my team regarding the acquisition terms. We'll be in touch. He nodded stiffly, his Adam's apple bobbing. Of course, he managed. I turned back to Isla, her eyes shimmering under the two bright lights. I've spent too long letting you write my role, I said. Tonight, I took the pen back. Her eyes widened, a tear finally falling. Dorian, please. But I'd said what I needed to say. I slipped into my jacket, adjusted the collar, and moved toward the door. The party behind me felt small now, like a set built for a performance that had already ended. The laughter was gone. The music felt wrong, a tinny background noise that didn't match the tension in the air. Outside, The night was cool and still. I let the door close softly behind me, the click sounding final. I walked toward the curb where the car service I'd ordered was already waiting, the driver's eyes forward, polite but detached. "Mr. Ellison?" he asked, stepping out to open the door. I nodded. Yes. He didn't need to know what had happened inside. The world outside that room didn't need the curated drama Isla had built. They didn't need the story she tried to sell. As I settled into the back seat, I watched the house grow smaller in the window, the laughter inside turned to whispers, the lights dimmed by the quiet. The driver pulled away slowly, the night opening up in front of us. My phone buzzed with a text from Isla. "Please come back inside. Let's talk about this." I stared at it for a moment before turning the screen off. I'd spent years driving her to parties, fixing her faucets, and letting her curate the story of us to fit her world. I'd played the role she needed me to play because I thought that was love. But tonight, I realized something. I didn't need her narrative anymore. The car glided through the city, streetlights blurring into streaks of gold and white. I watched them, feeling the night press cool against the glass. No fireworks. No revenge monologue. I didn't need one. Because sometimes the strongest statement is leaving the room with your dignity intact. Tomorrow, my assistant would send Wexley a revised contract, new terms, new expectations. Tomorrow, the world would remember the name Dorian Ellison, not as Isla's weird cousin, but as the man who owned the room, even when he left it in silence. The party might have ended early, but for me, it felt like the real beginning. The morning sun sliced through the blinds of my office like an uninvited guest. It caught the edges of the polished mahogany desk, the framed degrees on the wall, the thick glass door that separated me from the world I'd spent years building. I sipped my coffee black, no sugar, and let its bitter strength settle the knots in my chest. I didn't have to guess what was coming. The heavy footfalls outside my office were Isla's signature, her heels clicking against the marble like a war drum, each step announcing her arrival before the handle even turned. I took a deep breath, setting the mug down with deliberate calm. She flung the door open before I could grant her the courtesy of a polite knock. Her hair was pulled back too tight, jaw clenched, eyes bright with something between anger and panic. She looked at me like I was a stranger. Maybe she'd never really seen me at all. "Why didn't you tell me who you were dealing with?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Why didn't you tell me about the acquisition? About Ellison Dynamics?" I let her words hang in the air, watching them settle like dust on the polished wood between us. I'd been prepared for this conversation, though I hadn't expected it to come so soon, or with such fury. "Because you never asked," I said evenly. Her lips parted, eyes wide. She shook her head, frustration breaking the edges of her composure. "That's not fair, Dorian. Of course I asked. I asked about your work all the time. You asked how my little projects were going." I corrected her, leaning back in my chair. "You never asked what they meant, what they built, who they influenced. You never asked the real questions." She flinched as if I'd slapped her. "You called me your weird cousin," I said, letting my voice soften. "You put me in the background so you could stand in the light. That's the story you chose to tell." Her hands curled into fists at her sides. "It was a joke, Dorian." To them, it wasn't," I cut in. "To them, it was permission to treat me like an afterthought. And you gave them that permission. Every time you laughed at me, every time you let them believe I was small, you gave them that power." She stared at me, tears pooling at the corners of her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "Isla was too strong, or too proud, for that. I thought we were a team," she whispered. I almost laughed. Almost. But the sound died in my chest. "We were," I said. "Until you decided you didn't need a partner anymore. Until my presence didn't fit your narrative. Until the truth threatened the story you'd built." She took a step back, as though the distance could shield her from the weight of my words. "Dorian, I just wanted to succeed. I just wanted us both to be." "To what?" I asked, my voice calm, each word deliberate. "To shine? To be powerful? You wanted that power for yourself, Isla. I saw it in the way you introduced me, the way you laughed. You wanted to be the star, and I let you. For years, I let you." The tears came then, unstoppable, cutting black lines through her makeup. She tried to wipe them away, but they kept coming, like the cracks in the story she'd been telling herself for too long. She collapsed into the chair across from me, hands trembling. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know you were the one in the room." I tilted my head, studying her. "That's the problem," I said. "You never wanted to know." She looked up, eyes rimmed red. "I do now," she said. "Please, Dorian. Let's fix this. We can talk to Wexley together. We can. I held up a hand, stopping her words. No, I said softly. This is mine to handle. It always was. She blinked. But you introduced me as your weird cousin, I said, my voice as steady as the day I signed the papers that built Ellison Dynamics from the ground up. You thought you were safe because you didn't think I could change the room. She shook her head, tears falling faster now. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean. Isla, I said, my tone final. I'm not angry. I'm not even hurt anymore. I'm just done playing the role you wrote for me. Her shoulders sagged. She looked so small then, so fragile, nothing like the woman who'd once commanded every room she walked into. I'm still your husband, she said, voice trembling. Doesn't that count for something? I let the silence stretch, a quiet that said everything I couldn't find the words to say. It should have, I whispered. But you taught them not to see me. And now you're learning what happens when they finally do. Her lips parted, but no words came. I stood, adjusting my cufflinks, a small gesture that reminded me who I was. The man who'd built an empire. The man who'd learned to let silence speak louder than any apology. She didn't follow me this time. She stayed in the chair, staring at the floor, her world crumbling around her. I paused at the door, my hand on the handle. Who's in the room now, Isla? I asked, not expecting an answer. I walked out before she could try to give me one. The office door clicked shut behind me, a soft finality that felt like closure. The sun through the blinds felt brighter somehow, the air clearer. I wasn't her weird cousin anymore. I was Dorian Ellison. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to own every inch of the room. It didn't take long after that morning for Isla to pivot. She'd always been quick to adapt, quick to repackage herself, quick to reframe the narrative when the spotlight shifted. I'd seen her do it 100 times with colleagues, friends, even family, smooth over a messy truth with a well-placed smile or a flattering apology. But this time, she didn't have the same leverage. She'd lost the script, and she knew it. It started with a text that arrived barely an hour after she'd left my office. Let's have dinner tonight. Just us. No explanation. No apology. Just a quiet plea for an audience. I ignored it. Then came the second text. Bertrand's worried. He wants to meet us both. It might help us realign on the acquisition strategy. Us. That was new. She'd never called us a team before unless it was convenient. I read it twice, feeling the weight of the word in her carefully constructed tone. I didn't reply. 3 hours later, she was at my door again. This time in a carefully curated blouse and tailored pants, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, makeup flawless, voice even. I let her in, but I didn't stand to greet her. I let her fill the silence, let her shape her lines, let her put on the show she'd been rehearsing since the party ended early. Dorian, she began, her voice calm and measured. I know things have been complicated. I kept my gaze steady. Complicated, I repeated, my tone unreadable. She pressed her lips together, choosing her words like she was playing chess. I shouldn't have introduced you that way, she said. That was thoughtless. I see that now. I let her continue. I wanted to see how she'd spin it, how she'd try to mold me into a piece that fit back into her design. But now, she went on, leaning forward, we have a real opportunity here. You're in the driver's seat. The acquisition. The new narrative. It's everything. For both of us. She paused, waiting for me to jump in. When I didn't, she pressed on, voice soft and pleading. Wexley wants to meet with us. He's worried about the optics, about how this might affect the merger. But together. Together, I echoed, feeling the word twist in my mouth. You mean now that you know who I am? Now that you know what I'm worth? Her eyes widened, but she didn't flinch. She'd always been good at playing the victim when it suited her. Dorian, it's not like that, she said. I've always believed in you. I just didn't. Didn't what? I asked, my voice low. Didn't see me? Didn't want to see me? Didn't think you needed me until I became useful to your narrative again? She reached across the desk, her fingers trembling. Please, Dorian. Let's not fight about this. We can rewrite the story. We can be the couple everyone looks up to. Power couple. A team. Her voice caught on the last word, as if even she knew it sounded forced. I leaned back in my chair, studying her. For years I'd let her shape the story, let her tell everyone who I was and who I wasn't. I'd smiled at the right moments, let her control the narrative because it kept the peace. But now, I didn't owe her that courtesy anymore. No, I said. The word was small, but it felt final. Her hand dropped, her shoulders sagging. Dorian, please. I need this. We need this. We canoe. I cut her off with a look. You need this, I corrected. You need me to patch the cracks in your story. You need me to be the man who smiles in the photos, the man who stands at your side while you spin the tale of us. But I'm not that man anymore. I never was. Her mouth opened, but I saw the defeat in her eyes. For the first time, I saw her truly understand that the power she'd wielded over me was gone. That the script she'd written for us was no longer mine to read from. She blinked, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean to. It doesn't matter what you meant, I said. It matters what you did. And now it matters what I choose to do next. Her tears fell then, silent and slow. What are you going to do? She asked, voice trembling. I stood, smoothing the front of my shirt. I'm going to write my own chapter, I said. And you can write yours. Her lips parted like she might protest, but I didn't give her the chance. I'm busy finishing my own story now, I said, my voice calm but firm. And I don't have room for the revisions you're trying to make. She swallowed hard, her face pale. Dorian, please. But I'd already turned away. I walked to the window, letting the sun warm my face. Outside, the city hummed with life, cars moving, people walking, deals being made, stories unfolding. I'd spent too long letting Isla shape my place in the world, too long letting her decide how I fit into her carefully curated narrative. Not anymore. Behind me, Isla's voice broke. Dorian, what will people say about me? I didn't turn around. They'll say whatever they want to say, I said quietly. And I'll let them, because their words don't change who I am. She let out a small sob, but I didn't move. I didn't need to, because in that moment, I knew the only story that mattered was the one I was finally writing for myself. And I wouldn't let her, or anyone else, hold the pen ever again. It didn't take long for the press to catch wind of the shift at Wexley's firm. I'd expected that. The journalists who covered the tech and finance beat were sharks in tailored suits, always ready to pounce on the scent of fresh drama. But what I didn't expect was how fast my name would light up headlines. It started with a statement from Wexley's firm, carefully worded, as though they'd spent all night with lawyers polishing every syllable. Strategic leadership realignment at Wexley and Company ensures a future of sustainable growth. Translation? They'd been caught off guard, and now they were scrambling. The press picked it up like a torch. My name, Dorian Ellison, appeared alongside phrases like unexpected stakeholder, the ghost founder, and the man who changed the room. Some articles called me a quiet kingmaker. Others dug into old interviews from my early days with Ellison Dynamics, piecing together a story I'd never bothered to tell. And through it all, Isla's face hovered at the edge of the narrative, blurred but never absent. At first, she called me in a panic. Dorian, they're calling me for statements. What should I? Say whatever you want, I said, my voice calm. I'm not giving a statement. Her breath caught. You're not going to defend me? I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of every time I'd smoothed her path, every time I'd let her be the star while I stayed in the wings. No, I said. I'm not. The phone clicked silent. A week later, the press conference arrived, Wexley's attempt to salvage his narrative. They'd lined up their top brass in a glossy conference room, microphones lined like soldiers. The backdrop was corporate perfect, navy blue with the Wexley and Company logo repeated like wallpaper. I watched from the back, a silent observer. I hadn't planned to come, but curiosity pulled me in. I wanted to see how they'd spin the story, how they'd rewrite the lines I'd torn through with a single name. Wexley stepped up, clearing his throat. His voice was steady, but I could see the tremor in his hands. We'd like to thank our partners, investors, and especially Mr. Dorian Ellison, whose contributions have been significant. He paused, glancing around the room like a man hoping for rescue. No one moved. Then he added, we're confident that with our realignment, we'll be able to move forward with integrity and collaboration. Collaboration. That word used to be their safe haven. A way to make themselves feel like the decisions they made didn't leave bodies in their wake. I stepped forward, not because I wanted the spotlight, but because I learned that sometimes the quietest man in the room needed to be the one who spoke. Reporters turned, cameras shifted. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Mr. Ellison, a woman from the finance section called out. Do you have a comment on Wexley's statement? Some say your sudden involvement disrupted their entire Q4 strategy. Care to respond? I met her gaze, steady and calm. Sometimes, I said, voice even, the rooms we walk into already have stories written for us. And sometimes it takes a name to remind people who really owns the narrative. Her eyes widened, pen frozen on her pad. I could feel Isla watching me, even though I couldn't see her. Another reporter leaned forward, voice eager. Mr. Ellison, is it true you attended a company function as a relative to your own wife? Is that how this all started? A chuckle rippled through the room, but I didn't let it throw me. I looked him in the eye. Sometimes, I said, the people closest to us underestimate the parts of us they can't see. And sometimes, that's the greatest advantage a man can have. More pens scribbled. More cameras clicked. A third voice, softer, more cautious. Mr. Ellison, do you feel this experience has changed your relationship with Wexley and Company? And if I may ask, your relationship with your wife? The question hit like a bullet, but I didn't flinch. With Wexley and Company, I said, it's changed for the better. We now understand each other's positions very clearly. As for my wife, I paused, letting the air settle. I think it's up to her to decide which story she wants to tell. The room stilled. Even Wexley seemed to hold his breath. A hush followed, the kind of silence that only comes when the truth has been spoken and no one's sure how to fill the space it leaves. I didn't linger. I nodded to the reporters, to Wexley, and turned to leave. As I walked toward the door, a young journalist with bright eyes and a trembling voice called out. Mr. Ellison, she said, your statement about being misjudged, it's gone viral. Investors are calling you the ghost founder who became a legend overnight. How does that feel? I paused, hand on the door, and let her words sink in. The ghost founder. The man they'd underestimated until he'd stepped out of the shadows. I turned back and met her eyes. It feels right, I said. Sometimes the labels people give you are just shadows of their own understanding. If I can use that label to open doors for others who've been underestimated, then I'll wear it proudly. The room erupted in a flurry of questions, but I didn't stay to answer them. Outside, the sun was warm on my face, a fresh breeze chasing the last of the tension from my shoulders. Isla would see the headlines. She'd hear the sound bites. She'd know that the man she'd tried to keep small was now the name everyone wanted to know. And maybe, just maybe, she'd realize that the story she'd tried to control had finally been corrected by the man she'd once called her weird cousin. And I wasn't going back. The morning after the press conference, I woke up to a string of notifications lighting up my phone like a strobe. My name was everywhere. Tech blogs, financial journals, even mainstream outlets that normally couldn't spell Ellison Dynamics were calling me the ghost founder who shook the boardroom. I'd become the man behind the curtain. Except now the curtain was gone, and every camera wanted a piece of my face. I'd never cared about that. I built Ellison Dynamics from an old Dell laptop and a second-hand coffee pot in a studio apartment. I'd written code at 3 in the morning, pitched investors who looked at me like I was wasting their time. Every line of code, every late night, every contract signed was a piece of me. And that was the part Isla never saw, the foundation she'd mocked every time she called me eccentric. She'd always preferred her version of me, the guy in sweatpants with coffee stains on his shirt. She thought that was safe, someone she could place in the corner, someone she could frame as harmless. But now, with the world calling my name and investors wanting to know what Ellison Dynamics would do next, her script was in tatters. It was a Thursday when I got the idea for the Eccentric Branch Initiative. I'd been sitting at my desk, a mug of black coffee cooling by my elbow, watching emails roll in like a tide I had no intention of answering. Some were congratulatory, old college friends suddenly remembering they'd known me back when. Others were opportunistic, CEOs and venture capitalists wanting to cash in on the new headline. But one email stuck with me. It was from a young founder, barely 22, with a small team trying to get a sustainable housing prototype off the ground. The subject line read, "They said I wasn't serious enough to be in the room." His message was raw, desperation clinging to every sentence. He'd been laughed out of a pitch meeting by men in tailored suits who told him he didn't present the right image. He thanked me for my quote at the press conference, about labels, about being underestimated. He said it made him feel like maybe he wasn't the problem. I read it twice, and then a third time. That was the part Isla never got. What it felt like to be treated like an outsider at your own table. To have people look past you because your shoes weren't polished enough, because you didn't speak their language, because you didn't fit the mold they'd drawn. She'd spent years perfecting her brand, but she'd never had to fight for a seat at the table. I remembered that first boardroom I'd stepped into, 7 men in suits who asked me if I was the IT guy. I'd learned then that the best way to win was to let them think I didn't belong, and then sign the contract under their noses. That email from the young founder lit a spark in me. I wanted to build something for people like him, people like me. Something that didn't care if you had the right suit or the right tone or the right brand. A place where ideas mattered more than image. So I called my assistant, Eva, a woman who'd seen me build Ellison Dynamics from a single server rack in a rented closet. She picked up on the first ring. "Morning, Dorian," she said, voice bright. "How can I help?" "Eva," I said, feeling the words form with a certainty that felt like steel in my chest. "I want to set up a mentorship fund. Something small to start. A place where young founders can come with nothing but an idea and get the tools they need to build it." There was a pause on the line, and then a smile I could hear. "What do you want to call it?" I didn't have to think. "The Eccentric Branch Initiative," I said. A nod to what they used to call me in the rooms they thought I didn't belong in. Eva let out a quiet laugh, warm and knowing. "Perfect," she said. "I'll get started on the paperwork today." I hung up feeling lighter than I had in years. By noon, I'd sketched out the vision on a whiteboard. Small grants, mentorship programs, community networking. A place where people could find the resources I'd fought so hard to get on my own. That afternoon, I sat for an interview with a business magazine that had been hounding me all week. The reporter, a young woman named Layla, asked me about the Eccentric Branch Initiative. Her eyes lit up as I explained the concept, and by the time I finished, she was scribbling notes so fast her pen blurred. "Why call it that?" she asked, curiosity bright in her eyes. I leaned back in my chair, letting the words settle. "Because people love to label what they don't understand," I said. "They call you eccentric, weird, different, because it's easier than admitting they don't know how to measure you. But sometimes that label becomes the thing that builds a bridge for someone else. And if I can be that bridge, I'll wear the label proudly." She sat in stunned silence for a moment before asking, "Did that label ever hold you back?" I smiled, slow and steady. "No," I said. "It gave me the advantage. Because while they were underestimating me, I was building something they couldn't even see." The quote went viral within hours. Screenshots filled my social feeds, my inbox. People tagged me in posts, thanking me for making them feel seen. I couldn't help but think of Isla, sitting somewhere with her phone in her hand, watching the narrative slip out of her control. She'd built her image on power and perfection, on making the world believe she was the center of every story. But the foundation she'd mocked had become the one the world wanted to stand on. 2 days later, I got a text from her. Just one line. "This Eccentric Branch Initiative, does it have room for us?" Us. I didn't answer, because some bridges aren't meant for the people who tried to tear them down. Instead, I called Eva and told her to make the first grant from the fund. When the press asked about it, I kept it simple. "Sometimes, the world tries to tell you who you are," I said. "They shrink you, label you, underestimate you. But if you build your own foundation, if you own it, they can never take it away." That quote went viral too. I watched the headlines shift from Isla's eccentric cousin to the founder who built the bridge. And in the quiet of my office, the place she'd called my little lab, I felt the weight of her laughter fall away. Because in the end, the foundation she mocked had become the one that changed everything. Months passed. The headlines cooled. The viral quotes faded from social feeds as the world found new stories to chase. But the echoes lingered. My name in boardrooms, my face in news articles, my quotes printed on the screens of kids who once felt like I did. Overlooked, underestimated, overshadowed. I'd never set out to become a hero or a legend or the face of the underestimated. But somewhere along the way, my silence had become a voice for people who'd been told they didn't belong. And I carried that responsibility the way I'd carried every challenge before it, steady, unflinching, determined to do something with it. Isla's text stopped after the third unanswered message. The last one was an apology, lengthy, carefully worded, a performance of regret that dripped with everything she'd always been. Calculated, curated, composed. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't care, but because I did. Because I'd spent too many years letting her shape my silence into something convenient for her narrative. I didn't need her apology. I didn't need her to name me, or acknowledge me, or validate me. Because for the first time, I learned that my worth wasn't something she could grant or revoke. It was a Tuesday morning, gray skies, coffee cooling beside me, the hush of the city a comforting white noise, when I met her in the cafe. She wasn't supposed to be there. I'd come to meet with a young entrepreneur from the Eccentric Branch Initiative, a bright-eyed kid named Javier who had a prototype for a water filtration system that could save lives. But Isla was already sitting at a corner table, eyes locked on the door. She looked small in the morning light, no curated makeup, no bright lipstick, just Isla, the woman I'd once loved. The woman who'd once introduced me as her eccentric cousin. When I walked in, she stood up, her face brightening with something like hope. "Dorian," she said, voice trembling. I wasn't sure you'd come." I paused at the threshold, studying her. She'd always been good at reading a room, at adjusting her posture, at picking just the right tone for the occasion. But this time, she seemed stripped of that. Vulnerable, almost. I nodded politely, not unkindly. "I'm here to meet someone," I said. "A mentee. From the initiative." Her eyes darted to the table where a notebook sat open, a pen resting across the page like an unfinished thought. I saw the article," she said. "About Javier. He's impressive." I smiled, genuine and soft. "He is." She bit her lip, hesitating. "Dorian, I lifted a hand, stopping her. "Isla," I said gently, "you don't need to say it." Tears pooled in her eyes, though she blinked them back with practiced grace. "But I do," she whispered. "I never meant to it." "To what?" I asked, my tone quiet, but firm. "To diminish me? To make me a footnote in my own life? To introduce me as your weird cousin while you built your empire on my silence?" She flinched, and I saw the pain in her eyes. Real pain, this time. Not the performance she'd worn at parties. "I was wrong," she said, voice breaking. I wanted to shine, Dorian. I wanted to be somebody. And I thought making you small would make me bigger. I let the silence fill the space between us, heavy with unspoken truths. "It did," I said finally. "For a while." Her tears fell then, unstoppable. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." I nodded, and for the first time, I felt no anger, no bitterness. Just a quiet acceptance. "I know," I said. "And I forgive you." She looked up, hope sparking in her eyes. "Then maybe we can." I shook my head, slow and sure. "No," I said. "We can't. Because you're not the villain in my story, Isla. You're just not the hero, either." Her lips trembled. "But Dorian." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a letter, handwritten, careful, the ink smudged in places from where I'd gripped the pen too tightly. I'd written it weeks ago, on a night when the memories felt too heavy to carry alone. I handed it to her. "Read this when you're ready," I said. "It's the last word I never said." She took it, fingers trembling, eyes wide. "Dorian." But I'd already turned away. Javier was waiting at a table near the window, a grin on his face, his prototype sketched in a worn notebook. I walked toward him, leaving Isla behind. As I reached the table, Javier stood and offered his hand. "Mr. Ellison," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. I can't believe you're here. I mean, I know you said you'd come, but..." I gripped his hand firmly. "I keep my promises," I said, smiling. He beamed, his eyes shining. I don't know how to thank you." "Don't," I said, settling into the chair across from him. "Just show me what you've built." He opened the notebook, his hands trembling. "It's a filtration system," he said, voice steadying as he spoke. "Portable, affordable, for communities that don't have access to clean water. I know it's not flashy, but it..." I leaned forward, eyes locked on his. "But it's necessary," I said. "And that's what matters." As he explained the details, I felt a peace settle over me. A quiet pride in the bridge I was building, in the foundation I'd laid. Not just for me, but for him, and for every kid who'd been told they were too small, too different, too eccentric. Behind me, Isla sat alone, the letter in her hands, her tears quiet and unseen by the rest of the world. She'd always been good at stories, at spinning the narrative. But this time, the story was mine, and the last word I never said was written in the silence I'd claimed for myself. Because some victories aren't won with grand speeches or viral quotes. Some are won in quiet moments, in the steady rebuilding of a life on your own terms. And in that cafe, with Javier's prototype between us, I knew I'd already won.